they would be more outgoing and more confident than most people gave them credit for outside of the group, because they could talk when they felt free to talk about what was of value to them. And then, of course, because they're perceptive, see, introverts also pick up on a lot. They're tuned in to what's in the environment. They could really tune in to what the subtle feelings and thoughts of their peers were. And so they also did a great job of helping each other, which also made them feel empowered and also made them feel like they weren't alone. So there was so much of this: we're not alone in our struggles, we're also not alone in our strengths, which we didn't even know we had.
Hello, and welcome to the Quiet and Strong podcast, especially for introverts. I'm your host, David Hall, and the creator of quietandstrong.com. This is a weekly podcast dedicated to understanding the strengths and needs of introverts. Introversion is not something to fix, but to be embraced. Normally, we'll air each episode on a Monday. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite platform, leave a review, tell a friend, help get the word out there. Michael Alcee, Ph.D., is a clinical psychologist in private practice in Tarrytown, New York, and a mental health educator at the Manhattan School of Music. He specializes in psychology of introverts, artists, and everyday creativity and the professional development of therapists. His contributions have appeared in the Chicago Tribune, the New York Times, the New York Post, NPR, Salon.com, and on the TEDx stage. His forthcoming book from Norton, entitled Therapeutic Improvisation: How to Stop Winging It and Owning It as a Therapist, will be out soon. All right, I'm very excited for my guest today, Dr. Michael Alcee. Michael, welcome to the Quiet and Strong podcast.
David, it's nice to be with you.
Absolutely. So we're going to get into a TED Talk that you did about introversion. That's how I found you in the first place. I stumbled across that. I thought it was wonderful, and then I connected with you on LinkedIn. And we'll definitely talk about that, and a book you have coming out, and the work that you're doing with introverts as a clinical psychologist. But first, I always like to start, tell us about your own journey with learning that you're an introvert and how you embrace that.
It's funny. I didn't know I was an introvert probably till my mid to late 30s. I had always known that I was quite introspective and fairly sensitive, and really loved reading and the internal world, but I never labeled it as introvert. In fact, I thought I was the furthest thing from an introvert. It wasn't really until I read Susan Cain's book Quiet that I started to put the pieces together that this is somewhat an important part of my temperament. And also I realized, looking back on it, that it's also an important part of my mom's temperament, that we both could spend hours, reading and talking one-on-one and going in depth, but also having those moments where we're like, wait, I need a break from the world. And not knowing why that was something of how we were built, just thinking that was sort of a liability, thinking that there was something possibly different about us in a way that maybe set us apart in a way that didn't feel so wonderful. But it's only when I discovered the term introvert and how it was being re-explored that I realized, hey, this makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And just about every guest references Susan Cain. So that's a very important book, Quiet, for folks as they come to understand themselves. And again, this show's all about discussing, the strengths and needs of introverts, along with, we'll do some myth busting and some strategies for success. But that's the thing. It's a very natural part of our personalities, our temperaments, and it needs to be understood. And it's
Yeah.
beautiful when it's understood.
Well, what's funny now that you mentioned it, David, because I was thinking back, I didn't really quite locate this before. I started to discover introversion when I started to get very interested in Carl Jung. I always really, as a psychologist, always thought, Freud was a brilliant writer and a brilliant theorist and had captivating ideas, some of which, I didn't totally wholeheartedly agree with, but others I thought were really, really brilliant. But there's something about the way that he viewed the inner world that I felt that Jung did differently. Jung really appreciated even the dream landscape in a very different way than Freud did. He appreciated the inner world in a way, and even creativity and the arts in a different way. And there was something that felt more hospitable and at home about it. And when I went to therapy, when I was in grad school, I went to a Jungian analyst. And I think by really getting more of a sense for what that introverted world was like, was really how I discovered it first, but I didn't label it as such until it came more in the popular, um, the popularized books of Susan Cain.
Right, right. Yeah, and I agree too. It's everybody spends time in the inner world. Everybody spends time in their outer world. It's just as introverts, we spend more time there, and it's natural for us, like you were saying. And that's what definitely I came to the conclusion. And I was also the same way, where I didn't put a label on it for a long time. As I look back, I'm like, oh yeah, I did need my alone time. I did need to recharge, when I was younger, and from then on. But I didn't understand what it was. But I also, like many of my guests, at some point thought that there was something wrong with me. A lot of people have this sense, and not everybody. There's definitely some people that always have embraced who they were, are very confident as introverts. I always want to make that clear. But there's some folks that feel like they're broken and something's wrong. And if you can get to understand your natural, the way you approach life naturally, it can be a wonderful thing.
And it's also in context. Like when I was in college, my best friend, who was my roommate, was a deep introvert, and he could spend the whole weekend reading fantasy books. And next to him, I didn't feel like an introvert at all,
Yeah.
because I, would like to go out to parties, but then I would need to recharge. And so I'm more along the introverted extrovert portion. I'm sort of more of an ambivert. But a lot of what's interesting about ambiverts is people who are ambiverts typically get misconstrued as extroverts, because we can be outgoing in some ways, but also need to dial it back. And that could be really confusing to folks.
Oh yeah. And I think it comes down to, like you said, there's a wide spectrum, of what people need. And for the most part, we all need social connection. It's
Yeah.
just it's going to look different between people. What I need is going to, we're fellow introverts, but what I need is going to vary from what you need. And the idea is figure that out. What is it that you need? What do you want? If you're not getting that, how can you get that? And then I also think it's, if I am looking to be more social than I am, I'm not going to approach it as an extrovert. If I learn to approach it in my introverted way, that's where I'll find the most success and with it.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think it's really important to know your range and to know the sweet spot, like where it is that you really thrive, and what are your limits on one side and the other. Which could be the amount of time that you like socializing versus needing refilling with some more introverted recharge, walking in nature, reading, playing piano, or doing something like going to a museum, anything like that. And knowing the relative balance of that. And it's also very personalized. And I think one of the cool things about knowing ourselves psychologically is to tailor, to know what it is our specifications are. And introversion is one of the main dimensions of our personality, and it's one of the main ways in which we get energy, and the one of the main ways that we dispel energy. So I've always been fascinated that psychologists and therapists and social workers don't focus more on why that is, because if you have a car, you want to know if it's gas or electric or a hybrid.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and that's why I do this work, because I think there are very significant differences. You know, um, there's a few that really make a difference. Now, and you'll say the same as, of course, none of us are alike, and there's a lot of different factors in our personality that aren't based on introversion, extroversion. But I think there's significant differences that if you don't understand, you may not be getting what you want out of life. So
Yeah, I think they're really foundational and fundamental, as you're saying. And I think that's something that I think it's really great that there's more out there, in popular culture, and even in books and podcasts like this. And even in the field of psychology and therapy, that we're really making this a part of how we understand the psyche, because it is such a basic thing. I was really even heartened. I have a little boy, he's 4 years old, and he loves Daniel Tiger, which is like the Mr. Rogers spin-off cartoon version.
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
there's this wonderful episode where there's a whole episode like, sometimes you want to be alone, you can find a place of your very own. And when each of the kids are feeling overstimulated, the teacher's like, no, he just needs to be alone. And I thought how far we've come as a culture to start noticing that and respecting that, rather than saying, why aren't you playing more with everybody? So I just think it's a real cool culture change.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, when I was growing up, there was no talk of introversion, extroversion. And, definitely I've heard from a lot of people, there was that pressure to always be social when, maybe sometimes they wanted to be social, but there was plenty of times where they needed some time, and it's great for it's very important for parents to be able to understand that too. Parents, teachers, others,
Yeah.
it's normal, you know.
Well,
And
that's what I loved about it, to see it, and to see it normalized on a children's show like that, which, a children's show is all about teaching the basics. Mr. Rogers was always about teaching them the basics of how emotions work and how to help regulate them. And I thought, wow, they are giving such an important acknowledgement and validation for everybody, that there's times when we need introverted time, which I think is also an important point, that it's not just introverts who need introverted time. We all need it, because we all need to come back to that core.
yeah, yeah. And the causes might be different, why we need to recharge, like you said, how we recharge. Um, I think you mentioned the examples you gave were probably specific to you. Is that right? Like, how do you recharge?
Yes.
Okay. So tell us those again.
So, for me, I've always found, so I'm a pianist. So
Yeah.
for me, playing piano on my own, I would always go to the piano as a kid. I work at a college, and sometimes I would go into a practice room or take a lunch break playing piano. For me, taking a walk or hike in nature, or someplace where it's just like I get to be with my own thoughts, um, anything like that, like a museum, I find very, very restorative as an introvert. One-on-one conversation, all of those things I think are a lot of introvert sanctuaries for me, and introvert charging stations, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that last one, the one-on-one conversation. It's, like I said, we do a lot of myth busting here, and so many people think that we don't want to connect, but one-on-one conversation sometimes recharges me, with the right person. Like, I'm
Yeah,
enjoying this conversation right now with you, and it's not draining. It's, you got to figure out, okay, in that big group where, I'm expected to come up with a bunch of small talk and that kind of thing, that's going to drain me.
yeah.
But if I'm having a one-on-one, especially talking about something I'm excited about like this, it could be recharging or
Yeah, you know what?
energizing.
I'll use a funny analogy for it. I just thought of it right on the moment, actually.
Okay.
Because you made me think of it. Like, small talk is a lot like having your car engine but not driving. It doesn't let the battery recharge. But having a
Yeah.
one-on-one conversation is having that battery on while the car is driving. And that's constantly circulating energy into it. And it's a whole different story. But if you just, small talk is keeping that car on in the driveway. And for introverts, that just drains down really, really quickly. And I mean, I think in a funny way, introverts also just, we many of us don't prefer that. It just feels shallower. It doesn't feel as meaningful. It doesn't feel as substantial. And we also recognize the sort of social game that's being played, because some of extroversion is also playing a role and a performance. And one of the nice things about introverted connection is that you're actually going into a sort of more soul to soul connection, which isn't really a performance. It's rather a kind of deeper sharing.
Yeah, I love that. That's awesome. Um, yeah, some small talk is absolutely necessary to get to those conversations that we crave.
We
And,
can't live without it. Yeah.
Yeah, and if somebody's not very good at it, I do think you can get better. Some of that's understanding your introversion, like a lot of times it's good to be prepared for things. We think before we speak. Understanding some of those things can really help. But we're going to do some. It's just when it's just that's all there is, that's where some of us get trained.
Yeah, it's sort of like when you think of like certain holiday meals where there's going to be a lot of extended small talk
Mhm.
because people don't exactly know each other or don't know exactly the best way to connect with each other. And then you end up talking about the weather or sports teams or something that really has very little interest to you.
Yeah, that's it. So your TED Talk, and I'll put the link in the show notes, but it was called Introverts College and the Mind, Solving Our Mental Health Crisis. And you can tell us more about it, but basically you're a college psychologist and you're looking to put together a group. A lot of times in college we really want to help students feel like they belong and that type of thing. And so you're looking to put together a group. And tell us about that, the group that you put together, the hard time you got from your colleagues and
Yeah,
what really happened.
yeah, we're always looking for groups in college and they're never popular.
Yeah.
They're never well attended groups. And so you could put out the greatest group in the world and you think it's fantastic. And then very few people show or few people remain coming. So I decided I'm going to try something way outside of the box. And I decided I want to do a group for introverts. And then, of course, my colleagues ripped on me. Who's going to show up to that? And if they do show, are they even going to talk? And
Right.
they were giving me hell about how silly of an idea it was. And I put this funny meme on it, like introverts unite in small groups for limited periods of time. And I got such a great response, but I also would watch students walk past it and laugh and smile. But they weren't just laughing because it was funny, but because it sort of hit them. They understood it. And this group started, and a lot of the folks, I was surprised that it was like they finally had a respite from the rest of the extroverted world and they could actually let their hair down. And the other thing that really surprised me is that they were so talkative. They talked more, they got deeper, they were more cohesive, and it was an even more diverse group than I had ever run before. So all of the things that people said would make it a bad group were precisely what made it the best group.
Wow. Yeah. You busted some myths there. I mean, it's like so like what kind of things did they do? Like how are they engaging with each other and being I think you said it was the most talkative group you you had seen.
Well, yeah, I think one of the first things that they could do is that they all could agree on the things that there were their introvert hangups.
Okay.
And they found all of a sudden. See, one of the great things about group therapy is you find out that you're not alone in what you struggle with. And so they found out, wow, you mean you hate small talk too? Oh, wait, you sometimes get overloaded and people don't understand it and you don't know how to tell friends. It's not that I don't like you. I just need to take some time on my own. And oh, you have a hard time doing public speaking, even though you know your material. So, all of these things that they could then actually talk about more vulnerably, more openly, and feel more confident in just being who they were. Then the other thing is, despite themselves, because they're all so bright and perceptive, they would be more outgoing and more confident than most people gave them credit for outside of the group because they could talk when they felt free to talk about what was of value to them. And then, of course, because they're perceptive, see, introverts also pick up on a lot. They're tuned in to what's in the environment. They could really tune in to what the subtle feelings and thoughts of their peers were. And so they also did a great job of helping each other, which also made them feel empowered and also made them feel like they weren't alone. So there was so much of this. We're not alone in our struggles. We're also not alone in our strengths, which we didn't even know we had.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. And that's what I hope to achieve here is yeah, you're not alone. You told your own story, other guests tell their own stories. This is, where I'm coming from. This is what I've learned. And yeah, that sounds like a great group. So you also just mentioned, we're not alone, but we also share some strengths. What do you think is maybe a introvert? Sometimes they're called superpowers. Introvert
Yeah.
superpower of yours, and then maybe some you've seen in students or other clients.
Yeah, my son is a lot like me in this way. So we had a parent teacher conference. He's 4,
Okay.
and I'll never forget what they said. They said his name is Aiden. They said Aiden is very smart. He's very bright. He's very sweet. And they said, but he doesn't miss anything. And he notices all things going on. He like takes inventory. And interestingly, they said it in a way that was fairly positive, but they slipped and said, but, right? As if this perceptiveness or this thing was something that was getting in the way of him just loosening up and socializing it. Whereas when I heard it, I'm like, that's right. He's perceptive. And so, what I love about being an introvert is that you really perceive so much. And so, you're attending to a lot, which sometimes people sometimes see that as a liability because you might not act as quickly because you're sizing up and being deliberate. But it's also because you're noticing a lot more of the nuance. And so, I love that they said, oh, but he notices everything. And they said he did this funny thing when he started. When they started class, they usually have them just do free play. And they're like, well, he wasn't going and playing. She was like kind of watching everybody. They kept on saying, don't you want to play with this? Don't you want to play with that? So they said a few days in, all of a sudden he decided he got a baby stroller and he was doing the baby stroller around the class. And they thought, oh, great, we got him to play. And then they realized he was so perceptive that he figured them out too. And he said, huh, they want me to play? I'm going to make it look like I'm playing. And while I'm doing the baby carriage, I'm going to be surveying the landscape. So,
At
so
four
I,
years old.
4 years old. So I think one of the things that is a real superpower is that we're very sensitive and have a sensibility that picks up on a lot. And I think that allows us to be very empathic and very discriminating and also very in touch.
Yeah. And that's awesome that they recognize the strengths. We just need to
Yes.
keep working to get rid of that but, right?
Yes, which when they said it, I was like, and I just in my mind, I was like,
Yeah.
and he
Yeah.
knows everything.
Right, right. Instead of yeah, and
But I think that's what the culture does, right? It's like, wait, we're used to thinking success as, helping kids learn how to become more social and expand their circles. And so, the funny thing is we start much more close to the introverted inner world. And as we grow up, we are, expanding our social external territory. And I think one of our mistakes as a culture at times was to overplay the importance of leaving behind that inner world too much. And introverts just can't do that because that's how we're built. We can't leave it. That's such an important part. But I also think extroverts and people who are not as introverted still need to learn how to reconnect. That's why I think psychotherapy is so powerful, because I think even your most extroverted person sometimes needs to come back home to what's going on inside. And that's where I think introverts have a leg up. Like I told you before we started this interview, is that introverts actually have a lot of practice and a lot of comfort and familiarity with that place, which is also why their group ran so beautifully, because a lot of the basic things that make therapy go, introverts know instinctively.
yeah, absolutely. So, and I think that's, it's you're saying, I mean, I'm a deep thinker. I go deep inside, and that's one of my gifts. I'm a good problem solver, and I don't have all the gifts. Being analytical is one of them, and I can, make a new business plan. I can come up with a different way of doing things at work or at home, and I really enjoy that. And some people are going to be better at other things, maybe better than me at building relationships or telling a story.
Sure.
But like you're saying, that's a part of me, and I need to embrace it and not be told, well, hey, don't do so much of that. But it's who I am, and it always will be. But it's something that I really enjoy. But sometimes people are made to feel like, well, you shouldn't be doing that particular thing.
And I think you bring up a good point, David, for all of us here is that we all really need to come from what our core place is in and to be sort of naturally aligned with that and to be able to operate from that place first. And for introverts, that's important. For extroverts, that's important. It doesn't matter, but it's really important that we start from where we are, which is our home. And it's what's interesting. What I loved about that group is that when people in the group could be introverts and be in their home, the other stuff like being more outgoing came naturally. The things that maybe aren't our first instinct will come online better if we come from our core. And that I think is really important, that we come from that authentic place. And so even, how sometimes introverts also feel like, I don't like doing a job interview because it feels like too much marketing, or I don't like marketing because I don't like to be that slick salesman, right?
Yeah.
But the challenge is then, how do you make that come from your core of how do I share with somebody more about what I love about what I do, or how I solve problems, or what I like about what I've learned about your organization? Or how do I market in a way that shares what my values are? That's a way that you can still do this other thing, but coming from your introverted core.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, if I'm going for a job interview, I'm going to prepare for that differently than my extroverted friend. But I
Mhm.
can do it in a way where, I show my passion and my knowledge, but I'm going to really prepare in a different way than my extroverted friend might do that.
Which is perfectly fine. That's fantastic.
Yeah. And so you mentioned about being in alignment, and I know like being creative is really important to you.
Yeah.
How does that help when you're in alignment? How does that help bring out someone's creativity?
No, I think it's a really good point because, I think sometimes what happens with us is we forget which instrument we are, right? So a cello really can't play like a trumpet, and a trumpet can't really play like a piano. And so it's really important to be in alignment with what our nature is. And that's what I think is so fundamental about introversion, because it's part of our instrument, right? It's a really kind of nature oriented thing. It's not something that's just nurture. It's affected by nurture, but introversion is much more of a temperament thing, which is what your instrument is, how it's tuned. The more that we can respect our instrument and play in what it does, the better music we'll make. I have this cellist that I'm working with at Manhattan School of Music, and he was telling me, I'm doing this piece, and it's like really like avant-garde new music that somebody composed, and it's interesting. But it's like they don't know how a cello really works, because some of these passages are impossible. And so, unfortunately, we actually do that to ourselves psychologically, where we try to make ourselves do impossible things for the instrument that we have. So that's what I mean about really coming back and being more in alignment, because then there's amazing things that the cello can do, or the trumpet, or whatever. And there's so much range within that instrument, but you can't force that instrument to be something else. And that's something that introverts have struggled with because, for a number of years, especially since like the early 20th century, with, the extrovert ideal, a lot of introverts have been forced to try and pretend to be extroverts. And happily, we're seeing a more of an embracing of introverted qualities in business, in politics. I mean, there are so many notable people now that you can see in the public eye who are introverts, whether it's Meryl Streep, or Barack Obama, or Stephen Colbert, or Rosa Parks. Like the list goes on, and Gandhi. Like there's so many people who you could see who actually have that and work within their instrument.
Yeah. I love the instruments because they all can do amazing things, but they're different. And the
Yeah,
other thing is we need them all, right?
we
You
do.
know?
Yeah, and that's the other thing, and that's why I think sometimes, like sometimes people wonder, like, hey, when you're talking so much about introverts, are you putting down extroverts? Not at all. Extroverts are fantastic. They're like I said, they're like the trumpets. Like they will do something really powerful. They will take the risk. They will jump into conversation first and faster. They will keep, you look at some politicians like Joe Biden, for example, is a classic extrovert, right? He probably will stay in the room. Like Bill Clinton was a classic extrovert too. He could stay in the room with people for long periods of time. I wouldn't be surprised if Ronald Reagan was an extrovert too. right? But then there's like Barack Obama is more of an introvert, or, each of these styles brings something different. And we need them all. Like you said, we need all the instruments in the orchestra. We just need to know when we need to summon one versus the other.
Right, right. And I also say that, yeah, I'm never bashing extroverts. We need everybody. So, but we need to understand everybody's gifts and also needs.
Totally right. I think that's right. We need to understand everybody's gifts, everybody's needs, and also what are the challenges for each, right? Like, whereas introverts have challenges with being too much with people, extroverts have challenges with being not enough with people. And they will go into a sort of their own sort of crisis mode when they haven't, like being on lockdown was very difficult for extroverts, not being able to get together in groups or have more extroverted stimulation. That must have been really harrowing for a bunch of extroverts.
Yeah. And I mean, I think the same thing. I think it really showed us kind of what we wanted because we had to step back. And I definitely, as an introvert, I still felt periods of isolation. I had my wife and my three kids here with me. Sometimes that was a bit much, but at the same time, I missed other people that I didn't get to see as frequently. Like I didn't get to see my mom for a long time and other family members and friends. And so there was definitely a sense of isolation, really getting used to doing things virtually at work and other things like that. So I think there was a lot of misconceptions too, but I think we learned a lot from it. Is we all need connection, but it looks different. And I knew some extroverted colleagues that would go into the office when they didn't have to, just hoping that they would bump into somebody. So
Yeah. And I
I
think
think it
that's a
was,
great point too. I think that's a great point too about the introverts getting lonely too, right? They're we do need social companionship and social connection no matter what. you
yeah,
know?
yeah, absolutely. So you have a book coming out. It's called Therapeutic Improvisation: How to Stop Winging It and Own It as a Therapist. Tell
I
us a little
came
bit about that.
it
Hey,
came
yeah.
into the house today, first day that I got my
Oh,
hands on it. It's so exciting.
awesome.
Yeah, so
Congratulations.
thank you, David. It's really a sort of love letter to therapy and why I think therapy is such a fun and creative process as a therapist, but also as a client. Um, because I think one of the things is that we often know like how our phones work really well, but we don't always know how this machinery inside of us works. And I think one of the best gifts of therapy is to teach us how we actually work, and that in a lot of ways we're like a good piece of jazz music where we're always kind of going through different chord changes. And I think our job is to learn how to read those changes and figure out how to solo on them more articulately. And that learning how to live creatively means learning how to improvise, which is actually an interesting combination of knowing a lot about yourself but also knowing how to work with things in the moment. And I wrote this book because I wanted to help therapists learn how to do that, because I wanted them to help clients learn how to do that. Because I think we're all much happier and healthier when we are living with that sort of range and capacity. And I think, sometimes we talk a lot about mental illness and mental health. And I think it's great that we've isolated what are the different kinds of disorders that there are out there and how to help them. But I think sometimes we don't look at mental health more broadly as how do we live more creatively by understanding how this human condition works. And so I wanted to write something that kind of showed, especially beginning therapists and early career therapists, like how to put that together.
Very nice. What are some things that you help in therapy around the topics of introversion and embracing introversion? Maybe helping introverts gain confidence. What are some things you help introverts work through?
Yeah, I think a big part is like, a lot of introverts come in labeling themselves as either having anxiety and depression because they have it separate. And sometimes that is the case. Like somebody might come in with an anxiety disorder or depression, but there are a good many times when people who are introverts have anxiety or depression because they're not really as in alignment with how they work. And that anxiety, let's say, comes up when they're feeling conflicted about wanting to have time for themselves, but wanting to please their friends or their significant other. And then that leads to sort of inner conflict or turmoil that becomes anxiety, or feeling overstimulating and not getting enough of a break, and then feeling depressed as the psyche's way of trying to recalibrate. So, one of the most important things I think is trying to isolate how much of this is because we haven't kind of factored in how introvert works for you, and at least try to figure out if we make those tweaks first. That's why I did the TED talk, is because I felt like there was a whole lot of people coming into college counseling who had anxiety and depression. And I had this feeling that based on the numbers, if like a third to a half of the American population are introverts, imagine if a third to the half of the people coming into a college counseling center don't really know how their introversion works. And what if we can help them with their anxiety instantly? So the first thing is I like to kind of lean into like, wait, how do we work? And how does this help us know how we can deal with those things a lot better?
Yeah. And so it's, again, there could be a lot of different causes, as you well know, but
Sure.
just understanding yourself could change a lot of things for somebody.
That's a major tweak, and that can have major ramifications. The other thing is being more sensitive and compassionate with oneself of, wait, I tend to take in a lot and it takes me some time to process. So if I don't raise my hand immediately in class, it's not because I don't know what I'm talking about. It's because I'm tinkering with a lot, right? So there's less self-judgment about how you operate. Or like I said, when I'm an introvert and I'm picking up a lot of energy in the room and I'm feeling overloaded, I'm not feeling judgmental. It's because this wonderful gift of being tuned in means that I'm also taking in a lot. And so that's why we need time to recharge on our own, because we're not necessarily taking in other people's energy. So, one of the things that I think is really helpful is that it provides more self compassion and more insight and understanding as to why we work the way we do as introverts and how we work. And then that gives us a lot of options for what we can do with that. Right. Like I had a guy who came into session and he said, I went into class and it was just, I don't know, for some reason, it just was so bright. And he was, talking about like he's a little bit sensitive, like introverts and highly sensitive people kind of, they can overlap too. And I said, I think we should just be mindful and compassionate about that. And that some days maybe just bring a baseball cap or something in to allow you to have that room to not feel bombarded, because overstimulation can happen in a lot of forms. And then I think it's also learning about like how we can respect ourselves based on those rules, not on the rules that maybe we're conditioned to, of like, you should never leave a classroom if you're feeling overstimulated, right? Or like, one of the other, I also like to have like emergency introvert hacks, right? So like if you're on a dinner date with somebody, or like, out with your significant other and you're just getting overstimulated and you just need like so much noise, you've been socializing maybe with a group and you just need a break. The introvert hack is go to the bathroom for 15 minutes. Even if you don't have to go get a breath of fresh air. You don't have to even tell anybody. Just say you're going to the bathroom. But the point is, get your time to refill and give your time to let your system regulate again.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, make that normal, make that okay. I had an
Yeah.
elementary school teacher on not too long ago, and she said that there were certain students in her class that would go to the bathroom about the same time every day. And she figured that out, like, oh, she figured, and she was an introvert herself, and she figured out, oh, they just need to recharge. So she made that very normal for them. Hey, if you need to, just let me know. And I think she had a certain signal they could give, and that was okay. Or maybe I just went to a in-person conference for the first time in a couple of years. It felt good,
Yeah.
but there was a time where I would have felt weird just taking a walk outside by myself, to get a break. But just realizing, hey, this is normal. I don't need to feel weird about that. Maybe that's just what you need. It's just take a walk outside for a minute if things get to be too much.
It's true. And I think we also need to forgive ourselves and give ourselves room, because we then internalize a critic inside of ourselves that it's no longer outside of us shaming us, but it's now inside of us. And so I remember I used to work at a college like you, and I worked 9 to 5, and I'd be so burnt out by the end of the day, right? And now as a therapist, what I do is I do a session or two or maybe three, but then I factor in walking time, right? Or even sometimes I love having walking sessions where I'm talking to somebody on the phone or walking in person with them. And that is a different experience. And really I factor it in, like I calibrate it as part of like, how am I doing sustainable practice? And I think we need to think of our lives just like the environment, as how do we maintain a sustainability? And introverts are like, you know like frogs are like very, very sensitive, right? They have very sensitive membranes, and so when there's pollution in the water in a pond or a lake, frogs are the first ones affected. And introverts are very affected by their environment, and so this is also about really making sure our energetic ecosystem is in balance.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you mentioned, so when I first started working with students many years ago, I loved it. It was very rewarding, and trying to help them understand some things that would help them be successful. But at the time, I hadn't put a label on my introversion, and I remember that same thing where I'd work with back-to-back students. Again, I loved it, but I'm like, what's this feeling? Why am I feeling like this? And you just have to realize, hey, after so many, here's where I need a break, or here's a way I can recharge during this particular thing. And sometimes we need to recharge from something we really enjoy, but we
Yes.
still need to recharge. It's not always something we're
Funny.
dreading.
It's funny that sometimes it's too much of a good thing, and
Yeah, yeah,
that's the ironic part, which also can be confusing. And I think that's what I've learned too. I love my job too, and I was confused. I love it. I don't understand why I'm tired, because I do really love it. But still, you need to refill the well, or you need to kind of like let the field lie fallow for a little bit to replenish. And I sometimes analogize it to like when you get hangry. Like if you're overstimulated, you're like, it's like you haven't eaten in a while, and all of a sudden there's a point of no return where you're just going to get really super cranky, and you're going to get moody, and you're going to get curt. And usually that's the point where it's gotten to a point where you need to do some emergency, get him something now.
yeah, yeah. I like that emergency. What'd you call it? Emergency introvert hacks.
Yeah, emergency
Yeah.
introvert hacks. Like it's like stat, get
Yeah.
him get him to the bathroom, like get him out into like walking by himself, right? Like get him somewhere. And also the other thing is, it's good to scope out the quietest parts of the office building that you work, or the school, places where there are potential introvert retreats when you need them. And so
Yeah.
that's really good to find out where are the spots on campus, for example, where it's less trafficked and it's a nice place to recharge.
Yeah.
Really helpful to know that.
Absolutely. I think it's also really important to understand ourselves and be able to describe our strengths and needs, not just I'm an introvert, but really be able to say, here's what I need, here's how I work best, and be able to articulate that to our significant others or those that we work with. And so they can watch out for us too. And when we need one of those emergency hacks, they understand what it is. And it's not like, hey, I need
And
to
they're not taking
step
it
out
personally.
for yeah, that's exactly it. They're not taking it personally. I need to step out for a minute, and they know, hey, yeah, they love me, but they need a break because they have too much stimulation in this particular thing. So it's if
It's
we
a really good point. Yeah.
the more we can articulate those needs, the better that we can help people understand that kind of thing.
And you're right. The other thing is, it's really helpful for our partners to know it, our significant others, and also for us to recognize it in our children too. Like I can tell when my son needs his introvert recharge time, right? Like when he like just came back from school and he needs to just watch TV and just zone out. Maybe sometimes I can see him playing with his toy cars, and even my wife is really good about noticing when it's like, no, let him go with that. And so it's almost like I consider it like learning what are your tells. Like in poker, like when someone's a tell, like we're bluffing, but a lot of the time, but what are the tells?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
it's good when our significant other or family or people that we're friends with can tell that. And then of course, when we can give them that little kind of signal, and that they don't take it personally, like, oh yeah, this isn't about me.
Yeah. And so I'm married to an introvert, and we have 3 kids, 2 extroverts, 1 introvert. Again, that was one of the epiphanies that, oh, this is very natural. We raised
Yeah.
these 3 kids the same, and they each have their amazing own unique gifts. None of them are alike, but they're each amazing in their own way. And so I think for my introvert, I think he probably has it a little better than I did because, we understood that kind of thing. Like, you know what? If he needs a little time alone, that's okay.
Right.
But when you think of your own child or other, folks that you've worked with, where's that balance of, you know, um, understanding what they need, but also giving them that support to really, embrace their gifts and not just, not just stay in their room all the time. Where's that balance as a parent to really help that introvert, giving them the right, I don't know if push is the right word, but respecting who they are, but helping them be the best person they could be as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting balancing act of just like what you're saying, is really learning like what is the nature that we're working with, like what is the temperament and style, like what are the givens, like what are the given things that make this child go, and then also what are the areas where we can expand them and sometimes take them a little bit out of their comfort zone, but in a way that can kind of still feel like it fits with the fullness of who they can be. And so I think that that is a really interesting combination that we're always trying to do. I think it's actually the thing that's really interesting about therapy too, is because the funny thing about therapy is like, you want to both honor somebody as they are but also help them to change at the same time. And I think it's a lot about holding that paradox of I accept and honor who you are at your fundamental core, and I also want to help to see how I can help you expand in ways that can add something here. And I think it's the same way. Like, yes, we want to respect the introvert that wants to stay in, but we also want to help them see that there are ways that they can find ways of getting outside of themselves that still feel more comfortable. And that even though there might be some discomfort with some of it, that it's still worthwhile. Just like if you have an extrovert child like you do, right? Like, of like, it might be great to be like, I'm so glad that you get along with so many people and have so many friends and have so many groups to be a part of. And yet, I also want to kind of help you with the experience of being with yourself more and not feeling the need to jump to your phone or talking to somebody else because that's valuable in of itself. But I might not push that to the same degree because I would understand like where is their capacity and where is their experience with that. And I think that's where it also becomes really individual and also really creative. And I think that's like a wonderful art that we're always working on as parents, as therapists, as teachers. And I think honestly, the best teachers are really, really good at helping to highlight somebody's strengths and what they bring to the table, but also helping them to continually kind of open up, but in a way that doesn't make them feel like they're being pulled apart.
Yeah, I love how you put that. That sounds great. Um, we have talked about a lot of great things in this episode. Is there anything else that you want to mention that we didn't bring up yet?
Oh my gosh. I mean, I think people sometimes also don't realize what a great sense of humor introverts have. And I think that's also something that I really was charmed by in the group that I ran, about how clever, funny, engaging, and really, really interesting. And I think sometimes, like the misconception about introverts in the past is that they're loners or they're socially anxious or the misanthropes or anything like that, which is really, really not true. But I think it's just really refreshing to see that I actually think that introverts are so, so wonderful in so many ways. And it's so cool that we're celebrating that particular instrument.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny, there's a lot of misconceptions, and it's like, introverts don't have a lot to say, but I'll actually say I think we have a lot to say because we're always thinking, right? It's
I,
just
I think that's so
the
true.
yeah, the way we express that may be different because I'm gonna think about what I want to say and say what's most important to me, where it's just natural for the extrovert to speak while they're thinking, more so.
Exactly. Yeah. And, I'm going to think of questions or things that I wanted to say hours from now because I'm still going to be processing this lovely conversation. And, and sometimes, that's the way we work. And I think that's also something to appreciate. And it's a difference in terms of tempo and style, but it's got its own wonderfulness.
Yeah. And I mean, I think getting to know ourselves, we can prepare as much as possible, but it's our conversations or presentations or whatever it is never going to be perfect. And you've said through this thing, you really got to give yourself a break. So do your best preparation, but hey, I'll probably think of something too after we're done here. But I think we've had a really great conversation. I did prepare for it, but you know, you just got to get to know yourself and what you need, where you do best, but also give yourself a break and just realize that we're all people and we can always get better and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too, like you mentioned as well, is that we can also appreciate like how far we can go, how much territory we can cover, because introverts do have that depth of range. And I think that is also something worth being like, that's pretty cool.
Yeah. All right. Well, Michael, thank you so much for all the work you do with introverts and others. Um, good luck with your book coming out. If
Thank you.
people want to connect further or get to know more about you or your book, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, you can always check me out at my website, michaelalcee.com. I actually have a Psychology Today blog called Live Life Creatively, and the book is available for pre-order all over the place, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, you name it. So you'll be on the lookout for it.
All right. Well, thanks again for being on the show. This has been wonderful.
Thanks for having me, David. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I look forward to further connecting with you. Reach out at david@quietandstrong.com. Check out the website, quietandstrong.com. I'll add social media channels for me and my guests to the show notes. Please comment on social media posts. Send me topics or guests you'd like to see on the show. There's so many great things about being an introvert, and so we need those to be understood. Get to know your introverted strengths and needs and be strong.